Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to Inspirate, the show that's here to inspire you, to empower you, and to enlighten you. Today, we have a very important topic. What with the issues around gender-based violence, around women that are being oppressed in our society, yet with all the issues that we've been taught around women being so important from an Islamic perspective, yet we're still facing this critical issue. In studio, we have Fasiya Hassan, who is, I believe, the youngest member of the Gauteng legislature. Is that true?
That's exactly it.
Yes. Wow, that's quite an achievement. And we also have Ilham Biku, who is doing her master's in economics. It's been very difficult to get an economist, a female economist, onto the show. And this is actually quite an achievement, you know, you being involved, and specifically around development economics. The theme that this series is about is on ushering in a new socio-economic paradigm. We know what COVID has shown us, this gap between the haves and the have-nots. We just heard now that our unemployment is moving up to, I believe, Stats SA has a different view, but some say even up to 50%. That's like 22 million people, I think somebody said, that South Africans that are unemployed, businesses going under. And females being as the breadwinners of our homes are being affected. So from your perspective and being these young female leaders in your communities, how do you see the situation and how did we get to where we are with this number one gap between the rich and the poor? Especially in South Africa, we have one of the highest Gini coefficients. And then, importantly, from a female perspective. Fasiya?
So look, I think first thing, understanding that poverty and inequality particularly hits women harder. Right? I think that's a starting point that we need to move from. And understanding that we come from a country where, you know, people talk about this triple oppression element, right? You talk about the racial oppression, we talk about class oppression, which you've spoken about, the haves and the have-nots. And then you also talk about a gender perspective, right? Women particularly being under attack. So understanding that we, in a time of COVID, which already, you know, we already had an economy that was ailing. COVID effectively decimated that economy. And if we look at the job loss that has come from COVID itself, I think it's over 3 million people, 2 million of which are women, right? Because women have often been the ones who live or rather work in precarious sort of work. So whether that be domestic work, whether that be waitering, whether that be, I'm giving examples, right? It's just to show you that women in particular have had to take up jobs that are not full-time, jobs that often put them at risk of more gender-based violence and of femicide, right? If somebody has to take public transport, but their waitering job only ends at 10 p.m., imagine getting into a taxi at 10 p.m. and then having to go back home into a township. So not only are you at risk economically, that also puts you at risk of even further attack. And I think that's something we have to understand holistically, what it means to be a woman in South Africa and to constantly have to look over your shoulder, whether it be about the economics of it, whether it be about the safety of it, but you're constantly under threat, constantly. And we can't have this discussion without understanding that it's not academic, you know, for us. Yeah. It's not far away. It's something we think about all the time, even socially. I can't go to the bathroom by myself. I don't feel safe, right? Often I don't tell people where I'm going or where I am because I'm worried about them finding themselves there, but then at the same time having to send a live location to my family because something might happen to me on the way. So in order to have this discussion, I think we really need to unpack that whole holistic process of what it means to be a woman in South Africa.
You know, you mentioned three important elements. You said the issue of race, you say the issue of class, and then, of course, this gender inequality. Now, we can't get away from South Africa specifically. We've come from this ravaged apartheid era that had created the problems. Yes, and yet we're 26 years into democracy and still struggling with this very same issues. Now, from an economics perspective, and especially your passion around development economics, how do we get, I mean, for South Africa, I believe, importantly, when I like to discuss the elephants in the room, which is the fact that Black African women are most vulnerable, are most marginalized. And how do we get them into the economy, into the mainstream economy? How do we create a more abundant life for those specific, the most vulnerable in our society?
Okay, so I think you and Fasiha highlighted some very important points. One, that women face multiple constraints. So when we're thinking about policies and programs that are targeted towards women or that's supposed to empower women or increase their constituencies of development, education, health, earnings, employment, and all of that, we need to also realize that improving just one sector is not enough because of these multiple constraints, which can also be cultural, religious. There's a difference between access and opportunity. So maybe we expand the opportunities for women, but do they have that access? Not all women have the same access. So like you just said, African women in South Africa are the most vulnerable. And maybe some even religious women, like Muslim women, are they able or allowed to work? Do they have that opportunity to say, I would like to go and be a working woman? Even if we increase the opportunities for employment, will husbands and sons and uncles and fathers allow that opportunity to happen? The other thing that I want to shed light on is the difference between the unpaid and the paid economy. So women find themselves concentrated in what's called the unpaid economy. It's become synonymous with women's work, but we need to stay away from that stereotype. But it's also the invisible economy. So policies and programs are usually targeted towards the paid economy because it's visible, it's measurable. It's you see your production and your output, your infrastructure coming from that private and public sector in the paid economy. But women, whether it was before apartheid or after apartheid, what has continued is that more women are taking on those unpaid care work roles. So Fasiha mentioned domestic work as an example. That's one of the elements of the unpaid economy. With that, there's also childcare and looking after the elderly, the cooking, the cleaning. That's not compensated, it's not paid for. And if a woman decides that she wants to enter the paid economy, within the public or private sector, she has a different constraint to what a man does. She has to consider, will the earnings compensate for that lost home production? Will she be able to balance out paid and unpaid work? And it's different for men. I mean, men spend about 30 minutes to 2 hours in the unpaid economy, and women spend between 6 hours or more in the unpaid economy. And it's women that see themselves having to balance out their time between both of those economies, which creates this double burden of labor. So things like that, I feel, have still not fully been addressed, that unpaid, invisible economy. So when policy is usually directed at the paid economy, something like a decrease in public spending, for example, we don't see what are the effects on that unpaid economy. Women are the hardest hit by cuts in public services, and the two economies, they mutually reinforce each other. You need the unpaid economy because it contributes to the social fabric of our economy. Women are responsible for that next generation of our youth, the education, making sure that they're good citizens, making sure that they're active participants. Maybe crime would be lower.
I actually just want to ask Fasiha on this side, is that from a policy perspective, and you bring in a very, very good point, is that you actually really now breaking down what is the reality on the ground. And maybe that's unique to maybe a developing country like South Africa, this paid and unpaid economy. It may be very different in a place like maybe the US or the UK or Europe, right? And so from a policy perspective, have we ignored these realities that Ilham is talking about? The fact that we have this paid or this invisible economy that she mentions. Have we ignored it, and that's maybe why we're sitting with the problems that we are?
I think we've definitely not prioritized it to where it should be. And one of the things that South Africa is somewhat unique, and not completely, but somewhat unique, is that we tend to have very good policies, but really bad implementation. So if you look at the acts, if you look at the Labour Relations Act, you look at all these different things, they're like, oh wow, actually the policies are there. But when it comes down to the reality on the ground, and that's why I'm glad you've spoken about it and Ilham has spoken about it, that doesn't actually affect itself on the ground, right? And one of the things we're trying to do also now in this administration, and it's interesting that we should have this discussion now, particularly in Gauteng, is what we call the township economy, right? So understanding that there is an invisible economy, there's also an informal economy where most of our people tend to conduct the economic activities, right? It's not easy to register a business or a company. There's a lot of barriers to entry. So even if you think about small things like the lady I go to for my waxing or my threading, she's in the informal economy, right? She's not formally registered, yet she's a breadwinner and she's someone who supports not just her family, but the community around her. Because we're all going in there, you get linked to the hair lady, you get linked to this person, and that's a sort of microcosm or a small sort of organic kind of economy that isn't necessarily recognized formally, but is fundamental to the community. And so one of the things we're trying to do is support people like that. So we don't want to introduce barriers that are going to say, oh my God, you have to go and get registered into XYZ. We want to say, well, how do we support you in boosting yourself? How do we provide different types of funding, and not just funding, sometimes intangible skills, some training.
Yes.
So that we can take your business to the next level. So even Umama or Ugogo who's selling fruits and vegetables on the side of the road, how do we support her in bringing her to the next level? So it's about a multi-pronged approach. And this is where I think sometimes we miss it, right? We think that one approach, one size fits all is going to work. Definitely not. We need a tailor-made approach to different levels of our economy in different spaces. So
I want to just get to that tailor-made, because we're going to have to go to the break now.
Yes.
We're just getting warmed up. I can see the fiery zest that's coming from the women, and that's exactly what we want. Let's get to these and explore some of the customized solutions. It's not one size fits all, and also the reality that you're speaking of, this first world and second world, and how we can actually apply that appropriately into our reality in South Africa, the developed world, and Africa, immediately after the break.
You inspire me to be the best. You inspire me to be the best.
Welcome back to Inspirate, the show that's here to inspire, empower, and enlighten you. We have this very important, very critical topic that we're speaking about, women and their role in this economy. We touched on some of the realities in South Africa, this being unique to a developing country like ourselves, this first world that we live in, and comparable to probably the first world in most leading countries around the world, or cities around the world, yet we have this reality of this invisible economy, the second, which is probably the economy. And the question is, are our policies geared up for this inclusiveness? And is this why, you spoke about some of the best policies in studio, Fasia Hassan, who is one of the youngest MPs in the Gauteng legislature, an ANC MP, development economic specialist in Ilham Biku. And so how do we, and we said there isn't a one size fits all, and I'll start with you, Fasia. How do we address this issue of women being one of the most vulnerable in society? And just in general, how do we get this vulnerable members of society into enjoying the riches? Surely every one of us of humanity are supposed to be enjoying a life where you have a good home, you have an income, and you just have a better life. So how do we do this practically?
I think before we went to the break, I was speaking a little bit about the tailor-made approaches, right? So how we approach, let's say, a woman who comes from a rural area who doesn't necessarily have formal skills is different to how we're going to approach a woman graduate who can't find a job, right? And I think that's the first thing that we have to do. We need to understand that the group is not homogenous, right? Each one, yes, we're all women and we identify and have those very similar struggles. But in terms of the economics of it, we need to understand that it's a bit different. So the kinds of skills development we can do for a rural woman may be more around agriculture, for example, right, where they are, and around supporting different agricultural pursuits, because that's physically what's available. Whereas a master's graduate who can't find a job, perhaps we need to look at creating different opportunities in terms of the financial sector, for example. So I think that's the first one, right? That we need slightly different approaches depending on rural, urban, but also depending on different levels of education. Although, now that the numbers have come out and Stats SA has reinforced this, independent of education level, especially for young people and young women in particular, it's incredibly hard to find a job. So what we're finding is that we are equipping people with skills, but are we equipping people with the right skills for the economy? So you have to look at the drivers of the economy, and Ilham can speak about this, right? But amongst the three biggest ones: agriculture at the moment, automotive industry, and construction. So we're training a lot of psychologists, for example, but are we training enough people to compete in where there are actual jobs? So I think there's also a philosophical debate here as well. Do we want to train people to prepare them for the economy and just to work? Or are we training people to build society? So it needs to be a bit of a combination of both. It's not an either or. But given where we are right now, when a young person speaks to me, because I'm a young MP, right? My constituency is young people. They'll say to me, I want a job. And so they put us in a position in which we say, well, let's create opportunities for jobs. But what we're at risk of doing is maybe neglecting other sectors of society that need as much support or need that kind of developmental process. Because we can't just be building engineers and not be building sociologists, right? And not be building psychologists who are going to support and reinforce that. So my point here is that we also need to think a little bit differently as society, right? Yes, we want to study to get a job, but studying doesn't equal a job. And that's what we need to be very open about and very honest, because one of the fallacies that I think is coming through and resulting in frustration amongst so many young people is they think, if I study, I'm guaranteed a job. And that's not what's happening on the ground, and that's something that we have to change.
Yeah, so you make a very good point around matching what the reality is, what is our country requiring, and it not just be the visible stuff. I mean, the president is talking, and obviously from an ANC policy perspective, as well as even NEDLAC, pushing this infrastructure sort of drive in terms of creating jobs, right? Now, that in itself, the question then to you, as from a women perspective, is that if you say in construction, for example, firstly, how many women are there in the construction industry? But the other point you're making is that there could be supporting services around that. Like you say, sociologists and psychologists and all of those things that also play in terms of support services around that. How do we, okay, so the question I want to ask is, firstly, this infrastructure-led development, some may argue, and especially from an economic perspective, that it may just perpetuate this have and have-nots, this class structure. How do we make it inclusive? Ilham?
So I don't think, like we spoke about how development can't be a one-size-fits-all solution. It shouldn't also be like a narrow solution where it has to only be infrastructure-led growth or like private sector-led growth. Like it doesn't have to only be one avenue. I think we can come up with a development model that, like you said, is inclusive. Like we don't only rely on one sector. There was a point in time where, South Africa was calling SMMEs the backbone of the economy. We were relying so much on SMMEs, but SMMEs were the hardest hit during COVID. I mean, COVID exposed how fragile that sector is. So I think it's dangerous to fall trap on relying on one sector. So maybe, yes, there's a lot of potential in the infrastructure sector, but like you just mentioned, how many women would be in that sector? So how many women would we be empowering, or how many youth would we be empowering in that sector? It might not have marginal benefits. It might only benefit like a small group of people. So I think South Africa needs to look into a model where we're empowering and promoting and investing in multiple sectors at the same time. I think Fasiha mentioned the informal sector. That it makes up a large part of our economy. A lot of people rely on the informal sector for work, whether it's women in their precarious types of job, or some people work in the informal sector by choice. But we need to now think, we shouldn't try and like break down the informal sector and move all of that to like a formal sector. Why don't we try and like come up with an agreement, some sort of incentive for the informal sector to work with us? Maybe in exchange for paying taxes, we provide support and training and skills. We need to take what we already have, like I said, the SMMEs, the informal sector, this invisible economy, and aid that, grow it from like the bottom up. An example of an aid to this invisible economy I spoke about is like the subsidies, like childcare subsidies, paid parental leave, also some sort of tax incentives that benefit both, mothers and fathers. I definitely like welfare state models. And we need to also like delve into that different types of economics, like a welfare state model, and see what we can take from that would help South Africa in that, societal and economical sense.
So critically, and I'm playing devil's advocate here, is that I hear you say welfare state, but at the same time, one may argue that isn't that one of the problems, that we may move too much toward that welfare state and we're not growing the economy.
I said take elements.
Elements of it, right? Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So,
Yeah.
again, we're talking inclusiveness, right? So it's
Yeah.
elements of from different perspectives rather than just a one size
Yes,
fits
not
all.
narrow,
And,
yeah.
and I think that may be one of the problems that I am seeing, is that we may just be taking general economic policies and trying to retrofit it to our environment, and maybe that's where we went wrong. Fasia?
South Africa is very unique, right? So we can look at Scandinavian models of a welfare
Yes.
state, which I think are very important. I do think it's, and I'll speak to it in a moment. But that isn't the only way. You're quite right. We don't have, Scandinavian countries, they have a very small population but a large tax base, right? So they have 4 or 5 million people they're looking after, as opposed to 58 million with a very small tax base. So a lot of the economic ideas that hold true in Europe are not going to hold true here because it's fundamentally different. But that being said, there are some elements, like Ilham said, and like we've said, that welfare states are important about, right? Remember, the grant system is not meant to be a forever system. The idea is that you have a grant while you are still looking for a job so that you are able to feed your family and look after yourselves. But the idea is you must never, or shouldn't be full term or your whole life be dependent on a grant. It's meant to be as an interim or maybe in inverted commas temporary kind of intervention. But of course, if we are unable to create jobs on the other side, or meaningful skills development, you then become reliant on a grant long term. So that's why I'm saying that we need, I don't want to say a hybrid approach, I think we need a South African approach, one that looks at our truly economic state, but also understanding that we are unique in that we had hundreds of years of colonialism, and unlike other countries, also then had decades more of apartheid.
Yeah.
So in part of our economic substantiation, or our, making it more equitable economically, we can't run away from the fact that our country is so focused on identity politics because our entire identities have been forced into that box of race, right? So often people will say to us, you're only supporting Black African SMMEs. But the truth of the matter, and we've said it in this discussion, is that they are the most vulnerable and the hardest hit. So we can't pretend that there aren't these inequalities, right? So we can't just apply a basic economic model and think, all right, we've solved the problem, right? We need one that's honest and true to what's going on in our country, and honest and true to how we want to rebuild it in a way that is just and equitable, so we can get to a time where we don't see color. But we're not there yet, right? And we also have to acknowledge that these things go hand in hand, which is why at the very beginning I said this triple oppression thing feed into each other. We can't separate one. We can't solve the class problem without understanding that there's a racial issue, without understanding there's a gender issue as well.
What I want to do is, we've come to the end of this segment, and I want to actually explore in the next segment this unique South African socio-economic paradigm. And let's explore what would that look like. You touched on the resources that we're blessed with as this country. So if you take a lady that's in Hout Bay, who is blessed with the fishing resources, how would you use that as a mechanism in comparison to somebody that's out in the Limpopo who has this blessed fruit and industry that's exported all around the world? But how do you get that community using those resources to harness their development in an inclusive way? So let's do that immediately after the break.
You inspire me to be
Welcome back to Inspirate in collaboration with our partners, the Movement for a United South Africa, and our studio sponsors, Enza Home. We bring in you this topic around women in the economy, and we've been exploring some of the realities on the ground in South Africa, the issues that we face as a country, what COVID has brought to us in terms of showing this income inequality, the most vulnerable being women in this economy that are suffering, yet the opportunity is that women are so critical to the drive to this new socio-economic paradigm. We have Fasia Hassan in studio as well as Ilham Biku. What I want to talk about is, you spoke about this inclusive economy, this bringing the various sectors, Ilham, and using the resources I think you mentioned in our country. How do we galvanize all of this here to something practical? I'm now looking at it from a perspective of our viewers that are watching, somebody that's out there that might have lost their job, somebody that might have been affected as an SMME. And how can we, we speak in conceptually in a lot of ways, but how do we bring this down practically, right, to somebody that's out there, right? What can you offer this person, this lady that's out there that wants to get into the economy, wants to get a better life for their family? How would we see this happening? Ilham?
So I think one mistake that we're all guilty of is tending to blame the government for all our problems. But I think that to get to the economy that we want to get to, it's going to be like a joint collaboration between everybody in the society, between the public and the private sector, because the reality is we can gain a lot from the private sector. I'm not saying private sector-led development at all, but a combination between the two. So when we're thinking of, like you said, opportunities that we can bring to people at the very starting point, we need more businesses, more companies, more development banks, development institutions from both sides, public and private sector, to be offering those opportunities in combination with policies and programs from the government that can aid that. So what I'm trying to build on here is a model with multiple avenues for growth and development. It can come from a policy perspective, and it can come from an investment perspective from the public and private sector. So if more companies are offering investment, because look at a woman who's starting off with, like Fasia mentioned, threading or waxing in the informal sector. It might not be easy for her to just go to a bank, Standard Bank or FNB, because she's a high risk person for them. They're going to see from a financial point of view what is their chances of return, and if she's not a good investment, they're not going to invest in her. So where is she going to get that opportunity? She needs some sort of platform, like I said, a development bank or other institutions or other companies that are willing to take on those type of programs. We need a joint effort from every single member in our society, every single group in our society, and our government. So people need to also look internally. I know it's a cliche, but we say that change starts from home, but it really does. I mean, if any of us even see an opportunity of empowering someone, a youth member in education, or starting off a business, or we need to believe in ourselves, we need to believe in our fellow people.
No, you're saying that things need to change, and that's the critical, I think, opportunity that COVID has brought us. This opportunity to change. Yes, there may be a lot of doom and gloom out there, but at the same time, doesn't it allow you to reflect and to say we need to do things differently? But then again, human nature is such that you go back into the norm, and then it just goes back into status quo. How do we do things differently? Should we be doing things differently? That's the question.
No, I'm glad you brought this up, Yusuf, because COVID-19, you're quite right, in as much as it is a lot of doom and gloom, a clever person will look at a crisis and turn it into an opportunity. And that's something that we need to do as South Africa. COVID-19 has given us an opportunity to say we have a highly unequal society, right? We have a society where very few people have a lot of opportunities.
Yes.
COVID-19 is allowing us to break that, right? And that's why I'm using the word break very intentionally. It can't be a pause. You know, we press play, pause, and then we go back to what we were doing before. It needs to be a complete break, because it's an opportunity for us to restructure the economy, restructure our society, and restructure how we think. During the lockdown, it was more important, a ShopRite cashier, for example, to have them at work, to have a pharmacist at work, to have a doctor, than a hedge fund manager or a CEO of a random company. Whereas before that, the most important people in our society were CEOs and, you know, hedge fund managers, this investment banker. But the reality is that COVID has shown us that the people who we take for granted, the ones in our society who we think are the least important, yes, of course we value our healthcare workers, but we didn't truly value our healthcare workers.
So
and even how we understood our access to healthcare, right? People like, I need a medical aid. At the height of the crisis, even if you had a medical aid, the hospitals were full. Right? So what it showed us is that we needed a healthcare system, for example, that is equal across the board, which is why we're pushing across the National Health Insurance Act, right? To equalize access to a basic human right of healthcare. So that's one example. But what I think we need to do, and I'm glad Ilham brought this up, is we need more institutions, both government and private, who understand that the majority of our people can't just walk into a bank and get a loan. So we have in Gauteng what we call the enterprise propeller, the Gauteng enterprise propeller, CHEP. And their entire existence is to support SMMEs. So somebody who may not be able to get a loan from FNB, African Bank, whatever, can come to us and say, here's my business plan. It is a bit more risky than anyone else, but then we take surety as government to say, well, we'll give you this funding, here are the terms, let's discuss, let's negotiate, and let's actually bring you up so that you can get to a space where you're a medium-sized business, then you can go into a formal agreement with another bank, for example. But you know that initial, take a chance on me, give me the opportunity, let's run with it. But like I was saying earlier, it's not just the financial thing. There are so many people who also just need to know how to write a good business plan, who need to understand how business works. And often it's not something you're going to get from a textbook. And this is something I'm emphasizing a lot in the work that we do. If you're an entrepreneur in, let's say, home design, there's some things that you can't learn formally from that textbook, you know, the tricks of the trade. And we need to have this knowledge transfer, especially an intergenerational one, but a knowledge transfer to new guys in the game. So they don't have to keep making the same mistakes. They can start from a better position to not just empower themselves, but, you know, if a business does well, they employ more people, right? You're able to bring about economic benefit to a wide variety of people. So we also need to stop looking at this as an individual interest. I foresee I'm going to do well. We need to say, well, what can we as a community, as a society do to benefit each other? Because the moment we start to think in collective terms, us and we, and you take away the I or me, you begin to see, well, actually, there's a lot we can do together. And government uses these words, social compact. It's the same thing. It's about saying, how do we work as a community? Because at the end of the day, we all have a common interest. Whether we acknowledge it or not, we want to build South Africa to be as great as it can be. It's an incredible country. There's so much we can do. We're not like other countries who don't have money in the system, who don't have natural resources, who don't have opportunity. We have that. But often we're so interested in just pursuing it ourselves that we never do it as a collective. And I think that's part of the big problem as well.
You know, you say the social compact. I mean, it's a nice term that's being used now, but it actually comes back to that fundamental, like you were saying about inclusiveness, community. Look, we are here today. And if you think of your own life, of why you're sitting here today, there's somebody out there that has helped you to get to where you are.
Definitely.
Right? A mentor, could have been a parent, it could have been an uncle, could have been somebody that was out there, that you got experience that has helped you here. Right? Isn't this what it's about? It's if I'm sitting in a position where I have, maybe I'm resourced, maybe I have money, I'm able to help somebody that's more vulnerable and bring them in. Or I may just share the fact that I have some knowledge that I can share. And importantly, from an Islamic perspective, that's actually what we've been taught.
Yes.
Right? And it's so close to the systems of even Ubuntu and all of that, which is what? It's all about I am because of you, right? And it's all about collectivism, working together, whoever you are. I mean, I think that's what's the beauty of our father of the nation, Madiba, was aiming to do in that period, is to create, to say, how do we galvanize all the best of South Africans? And maybe that narrative has been lost somewhat because people are more desperate and they're more fearful because of the economy. And, you know, how do we actually be able to now galvanize South Africans in terms of collectively utilizing the best of every bit of South Africans, whether they may be the financially resourced, maybe they be the vulnerable, and work together to make this happen. Maybe if you could just, before we get to the break, Ilham, just share some light onto that.
Yeah, I think definitely South Africa is a country that is unique, but we've got that rainbow nation. You know, we've got that spirit of like diversity, and we have so many cultures. We have freedom of religion, even in Islam. Like South Africa is a country that really allows Muslim people to be Muslim people. You know, and I love that our president always, you know, when he greets, he'll greet in so many different languages. And during Ramadan, like he was so accommodating of that. And you're right when you say that it seems like it's getting lost along the way, and you gave the reason already. People are getting more desperate. People are losing hope in themselves. They're losing hope in this country. And it's sad because even if we look at gender-based violence, for example, I was even asking myself the other day, why is there so many youth engaging in gender-based violence? Why is it starting at such a young age? And you're hearing about these incidents in school from like 16, 17-year-old people. It definitely seems like there's something happening from, you know, many different levels, from a young level, from, you know, it's institutional, it's societal, it's cultural. People are losing hope, and we need to instill that hope again. There's many different ways that we can do that, and I think shows like this and social media and having these discussions is one part of that. We need to spread awareness. We need to be showing people that there are people out there that care, that want to make a change, that are still pushing to make this country great again. We can't all afford to take a step back or leave or you know, turn our face away and say, you know, it's a lost cause. We need to get out of that mentality that South Africa is a lost cause. We have so much potential. We have so much resources. Like Fasia has also mentioned, we have good policies. We just need to deal with implementation. We need to deal with corruption. We need to deal with, you know, making sure this society can be equal and just. And we can, you know.
Okay, let's go to the break, and we'll get to the last segment where I have some interesting questions to both the guests immediately after the break.
You inspire me to be the best. You inspire me to be the best.
Welcome back to Inspirate. We're here to inspire, to empower, and enlighten you. We're having this fascinating discussion around the reality that we're facing as a country, especially women. And we have two young, very inspiring, very aspirational women in Fasia Hassan, who was very involved, which I didn't mention, in the Fees Must Fall movement at WITS around 2015, and who is today one of the youngest members, or if not the youngest member, of the Gauteng legislature as an ANC MP. We have somebody that has been very difficult to get, which is a woman who is involved in economics, and specifically development economics, in Ilham Biku. And yes, we've spoken a lot around the problems we faced as a country, especially women, the fear that women go through. It's very touched around that. We, you know, as men, we don't realize the lens that you women view the world from, and the realities that you face. Yes, the country has all these generic issues that we're suffering with, but more so from a woman perspective. But importantly, we also spoke that, and especially from an Islamic perspective, we can never lose hope. I think that's what we taught, is never to lose hope. And our country is also built like that. I think the fathers of our nation was always around building hope. Who would have thought in the height of apartheid that we would end up with this beautiful democracy, with the whole world that has come to South Africa and loves it so much. So let me pose this question to both you ladies, and I'll start with you, Fasia. If I would, and I do this question with most of our guests that come in this last segment, if I give you a crystal ball and I say 5 years from now, right? We're sitting here. How do you see this country? How do you see, and the reality is that there's a lot of people that are considering leaving, having discussions. We spoke about it, there's doom and gloom. People have lost jobs. How do you see this country of ours in 5 years if we were sitting here today?
I'm going to answer it a bit differently. I'm going to tell you what I want to see
Yes.
in the crystal ball and then link it to this thing of leaving. When I look in it, this is my first term having been elected as a public representative, and it's a 5-year term. So I think very much now in like 5-year sorts of segments. And what I really want to see at the end of these sorts of 5 years are more young people, more women, more progressive people who are sitting not just on the benches of parliament with us, but across the sector. So whether you look at the private or the public sector, there's severe underrepresentation of young people and of women. And about how we need to put more and more people into that space. But it's not just about sitting at the decision-making table. It's being able to have a fundamental say in that decision-making. So when I look in it, I want to see a space in which we're not just taken seriously, we're not just sitting at the table, but we are a part of that policy making. We're a part of that implementation. We're a part of creating a better South Africa. And I know that it's very difficult right now for the community. I know that it is a lot of doom and gloom. But we must remember that in any history of any great country, there have been very difficult times. Even if you look at world superpowers, what comes down to it, or what's more important, is that moments of change and moments of crisis like this is when we need to band together the most. And this is a true test, not just of who we are, but as Muslims, right? We can't just run away from inequality. We can't just pretend that the prejudice doesn't exist. We can't pretend that social justice is not important. Something I always ask myself every day, especially when it's hard, if I were to die now, what would I say to Allah? Right? And with this thinking process, I push and I push in my activism, in my community work, everything, because it's not about us as individuals, right? It's our duty as a Muslim community to be more involved, to change the fabric of society, so that when we stand in front of Allah on the Day of Judgment and He asks us, what did we do with the life that He gave us? We can answer with confidence. And that's what I want to say to our community. It's not about running away. It's about saying, it's tough, yes, but what can we do with the privileges, the opportunities, the economic benefit that came from Allah, right? It didn't come because of us, right? It's coming from Allah. What do we do with that to change our society for the better? How do we uplift everyone? And when we think of it in that way, there's no way you can run away. There's no way you can turn a blind eye. Not when there's so much work to do, and not when we can and we have the power to do something about it.
That was quite a hair-raising
Yeah.
moment.
I got goosebumps.
Yeah, me too. Okay, well, let's pass that crystal ball.
Yeah.
Let's pass it on to you, Ilham,
Handing over.
right?
Yeah.
And, based on what you see the world in South Africa specifically, you're doing your master's right now. You're just about to complete, I assume. Want to see things from a development perspective. How would you see South Africa in 5 years from now if we were sitting here?
Honestly, I really do agree 1,000% with everything Fasiha said. Actually, I think she just hit the nail on the head, because she situated it so nicely with regards to what we need. We need more women, we need more youth in these very important platforms in policy and decision making. And that's, like you said, we underrepresented in even statistics. Another thing is we have a shortage of data as well. So when you're trying to do research and valuable research that can inform policy, you'll find that, especially with women and youth, we need more data collection. We need more people to be able to trust to actually do surveys. In South Africa these days, if someone had to come to your door and be like, can we have some time so you can fill in our national survey, you're not gonna, trust that that's legit. And I think that's a problem, that we're not collecting enough data to see the reality of, the situation. Even something like the unemployment rate. Yes, we have a figure, this is the unemployment rate. But there's so many layers underneath that. Like, what does that mean for people? How does it change their household structures? What is that balance between, like I said, the invisible and the visible economy? What does that mean for, gender-based violence? There's so many layers underneath that. And I think that South Africa also, in addition to everything that Fasiha said, we need to do more research. Research is very important in everything that informs us. It's a tool for knowledge. And we need to understand our context. We need to understand what our country needs. We can't just sit back and say, here's a solution. We need to actively go out and see where are the gaps, where are the flaws. And with accurate data, with accurate depictions of what's happening in South Africa, so that we can make informed choices.
Yeah, that was quite a nice balance. I see the political sociologist coming out in you, and I see this economist coming out in you, talking data, and you're giving us this grandiose vision, which is exactly what we need, and the combination thereof, right? It's about the science,
Exactly.
as well as this visionary leadership.
Yeah.
Is what, and the combination thereof, right? And if you look at, I think it's very, what you guys have done, I'm just thinking, it's just summed up the last 3 decades, because you looked at Madiba, who brought this vision, and then you had the more institutionalization in this last, and what we're trying to do right now. Just to finish off, the question I leave to you guys is 3 things from your side, Fasiha. I'll start with you. If you were to leave our viewers, and you can speak to them, and let's assume after right now, right at this moment, the world comes to an end, all right? And there's 3 things that you can, or we're not around. I won't say the world comes in, but we're not around. And there's 3 things that you can leave for humanity, right, for South Africans. Just 3 practical things that you can leave. What would be those 3 parting words of wisdom that you can leave practically for our people?
Look, in addition to what I said there, I think that holds particularly, but practically, I think that we need more opportunities in terms of linking our education to the economy. So
Right.
that's a fundamental part of how I'm sitting at this table, right? I believe in access, universal access to education. So that's the first thing that I would love to leave behind. The second thing is also around leaving an opportunity, yes, to get a job, but to get a job of choice, right? A lot of our people study things and do things because they have to, because they're coming out of poverty. They have to be a lawyer, they have to be a chartered accountant, etc. And I want to, inshallah, leave a world in which you can choose whatever you want to be. And it's not based on the economics of it, We're not there yet, but I hope that I could be. And obviously the third thing was, to leave a world that I think is more socially just.
Thank you. On your side, Ilham, the three practical, interventions, suggestions, advice that you can leave South Africans with in terms of how to just live a better life.
So you're saying practical, but I really want to mention love, because I really do think that
Beautiful.
love is a practical.
I think it's very practical.
Yeah, I do think
Yeah.
it's a very practical practice. It goes back to like any of our holy books, like love thy neighbor, and within love, I think there's so many other things that we can work towards, like trust. Trust is another thing that we need to work on in our country. Like there is such a thing as trust in an economy. How much trust does an economy have? There's trust index that you can even measure the well-being of an economy depending on their trust. People tend to trust members of their own group, their own racial group, because you have shared experiences, you look more like them. But trust declines heavily when you're talking to someone who doesn't look like you, doesn't come from your same community, etc., etc. So we need to close that gap between how we identify ourselves, and we need to see our similarities more than our differences. So I'd say love, trust, and the last point is going to be the same as Fasiha's, is a just and equitable society.
Thank you. We've come to the end of this fascinating discussion with these 2 young, vibrant women that have really inspired us and have discussed the realities that we face as a society, as a country, as humanity, but have also left us with a lot of practical insight and inspiration for us all. I, for one, have been absolutely overwhelmed by what has been shared here. I hope our viewers have as well. These are important young leaders, and I know that the fact that you guys are in your own respective domains, I know, Ilham, you starting or going to be getting involved in the economic world. Fasiha, you already quite actively involved from a political perspective in our province and, inshallah, in our country. We know we are in good hands with yourselves. On that very positive note, as humanity, we need to be on the side of social justice. We hope to see you for many of our other shows on Inspirate. We're here to inspire, empower, and enlighten you, and we hope that this has done so. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.